John Brown is the bloodiest of abolitionists who believed in killing as long as you were doing it to end slavery. Brown was born fourth of 8 children to Ruth and Owen Brown in Torrington, Connecticut, on March 18, 1800. John was raised Christian and their family moved around quite a bit. His childhood was mainly in Ohio. Ruth and Owen taught their children to hate slavery and to oppose it.
John Brown witnessed a traumatic event at the age of 12 when he saw a slave being attacked with a shovel.
At the age of 16, John moved to Massachusetts to become a minister, but later went into the same business as his father, raising cattle and running a tanner operation. And, at one point, John was a surveyor, checking out the land. John had many jobs throughout his life. By 1820, John Brown married Dianthe Lush, had 7 children, and moved to New Richmond, Pennsylvania. There, Brown made an illegal operation in his tannery, an underground railroad, a network of secret havens along the way to freedom in the North. It's been documented that John Brown helped more than 2,000 slaves in his tannery in the early 1800s. Brown's own life was constantly one tragedy after another. In 1831, John's son Frederick died, which led Brown to become very sick. Brown's life began to fall apart, and with it, his businesses began failing as well. This caused John Brown to fall into financial debt. Later, John Brown's wife died, giving birth to an unnamed child, who later died. Not soon after, John Brown remarried to a woman named Mary Ann Day. They had 6 children together. John then uprooted his family to Kent, Ohio. In 1837, Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was murdered by a mob of pro-slavers.
On the clear moonlit night of November 7, 1837, a mob surrounded a warehouse at Alton, Illinois, intent on destroying an anti-slavery newspaper run by the Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy. When one of the mob moved to set the building on fire, Lovejoy, armed with a pistol, came out to stop him. The slavery men shot him dead and dumped his printing press into the Mississippi. In Hudson, Ohio, a clergyman told a church gathering, "The question now before us is no longer can slaves be made free, but are we free, or are we slaves under mob law?" In the back of the church, a strange, gaunt man rose to his feet and raised his right hand.
And he was quoted as saying, quote, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." End quote. In 1839, Brown sank further into debt, and eventually his farm was taken from him by force. The federal court then turned around and announced that he was officially in debt in September 1842. The next year, 4 of his children died of dysentery. In 1844, Brown and a few abolitionists moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, where the abolitionist movement was taking off. This changed John Brown forever. John Brown heard Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth speak at lectures. By 1850, John Brown was completely radicalized and ready to kill. Brown's thoughts and conversations were getting more violent. Brown talked about violence being the only solution to end slavery. Brown made a bold claim and said that, quote, God had chosen him to lead a rebellion against slavery, unquote. Brown created an anti-slavery militia to protect runaway slaves. John Brown was living in North Elba, New York by 1850. He and his family moved to a place called Timbuktu, owned by rich abolitionist Gerrit Smith. Timbuktu was farmland where former slaves could not only grow, but prosper. This wasn't the life for John Brown, and his focus drifted back to his fight against slavery. A terrible law came to pass called the Kansas-Nebraska Act that left it to the states to decide whether or not slavery was legal or not. And they decided to move to Kansas Territory. 5 of his sons led the march. Shortly thereafter, an event called Bloody Kansas would occur. This was a series of massacres by pro- and anti-slavery groups. John Brown's son wrote to him, informing him that they needed guns. Nobody knew who John Brown was until the murders. In 1855, John Brown learned from his sons in Kansas that their families were completely unprepared to face attack, and that pro-slavery forces were active in the area. Determined to protect and fight alongside his abolitionist family, Brown left for Kansas, enlisting a son-in-law and making several stops to collect funds and weapons. In this time, Kansas was split into 2 factions. The pro-slavery group called themselves Bushwhackers, and the abolitionists called themselves Jayhawkers. Kansas was known as Bleeding Kansas during this time. As Brown went westward, he found more militant abolitionist support in his home state of Ohio, particularly in the strongly anti-slavery Western Reserve section, where his boyhood home of Hudson is located.
John Brown began his killings in 1856. On May 21st, pro-slavery groups terrorized and looted Lawrence, Kansas, an anti-slavery town. Not just any anti-slavery town, one of the leading communities against slavery. Brown was furious. Brown also was fired up about pro-slavery advocate Preston Brooks ruthlessly attacking anti-slavery advocate Charles Sumner.
The issue of slavery became more and more volatile and violent in the 1850s. You had, long before the war broke out, violence was working its way into American politics. Bleeding Kansas, which was a civil war out there. You had violent rescues of fugitive slaves. People arrested as fugitives, and then a mob would rescue them in the north and send them off to Canada. And you had this assault on the floor of the Senate, unprecedented, where Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina basically snuck up behind, it wasn't a very honorable thing to do, snuck up behind Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, while he was sitting at his desk after the Senate had adjourned. Sumner had delivered a very strong anti-slavery speech, I think called The Barbarism of Slavery, which Southerners didn't like very much. And he seemed to be insulting Senator Butler of South Carolina, who was a cousin of Brooks, the congressman from South Carolina. Brooks thought this was an insult to his family, and he snuck up behind Sumner with a cane and started beating him over the head with his cane. And eventually this was stopped, but this showed you how even on the floor of Congress, the North-South division was becoming, difficult to control, to say the least.
On the night of May 25th to the morning hours of the 26th, Brown led a murderous assault on pro-slavers, dragging them from their homes and murdering them. This massacre was known as the Massacre of Potawatomi.
In response to border ruffian attacks, white abolitionist leader John Brown orchestrated the murder several days later of 5 pro-slavery settlers along Potawatomi Creek.
Brown went into hiding shortly after. Captain Henry Pate ordered that Brown's sons be arrested. Jason Brown and John Brown Jr. had their homes destroyed and their families uprooted. On June 2nd, Brown caught up with Captain Pate, who was leading a group of Missourians near where Walden City would eventually stand. After a vicious gun battle, Brown came out victorious, capturing 22 of Pate's men and ordering a ransom. The 22 men for Brown's sons. The ransom was granted, and Brown's sons and the 22 men were released. This was known as the Battle of Blackjack.
On June 2, 1856, the American Civil War arguably began, though the Southern cannons would not blast Fort Sumter into submission for another 5 years. Almost 100 men fought a 3-hour pitched battle that ended with Pate's pro-slavery forces surrendering to John Brown. This fight became known as the Battle of Blackjack. After the smoke cleared, Pate would say, "I went to take Old Brown, but Old Brown took me."
Brown and his family went back into hiding. They continued their guerrilla warfare on pro-slavery groups, and August 30th was no different. However, Brown and his forces were outnumbered 7-1, and General John William Reed had the entire anti-slavery town of Potawatomi burned to the ground. This was a huge defeat for Brown. Not only did they lose the town, John's son Frederick, the second son, was murdered in the battle. In the fall of 1856, the bloodshed had calmed down and the violence was at an all-time low. Brown and 3 of his sons returned to the East to raise money for the abolitionist cause.
Over the next few years, Brown gathered guns and money, planning something big, continuing the fight to free slaves. Brown believed that he could free all the slaves. Brown believes that with enough time, slavery would be abolished. He was right, but he would never live to see his vision. Brown tried to recruit anyone and everyone he could to a planned invasion. He tried to get Frederick Douglass to join him. Douglass politely said no. John would later meet Harriet Tubman, and she helped him gather former slave forces to help him. Brown's eyes were on West Virginia, Harper's Ferry to be more specific. On October 16th, Brown and his forces took Harper's Ferry and raided the arsenal. It was only being guarded by 1 guard. Brown rounded up hostages and cut telegraph wires. The Virginia militia arrived by next morning on the 17th. By the end of the day, 8 of his men were dead or dying. 2 of them were Brown's own sons, Watson and Oliver. On the 18th of October, Brown was met with soldiers Robert E. Lee sent. By this time, Brown occupied an engine room that would later be renamed John Brown's Fort. Brown refused to surrender. Brown wanted to be a martyr on the spot. The soldiers swept in and captured Brown and his remaining men. After a rushed trial, Brown was sentenced to hang, and on November 2nd, Brown was hung. Brown was a hero, a murderer, a terrorist, and a martyr. All of these things can be true. Brown believed in abolishing slavery. His actions led to change. The lives he saved might outnumber those that he believed he had to kill. But Brown's heart and determination was a pure motive.